All right, y'all. So let's get started here with topic 6.6, causes of migration in an interconnected world. Make sure that you have your guided notes ready to go. And let's get started here as we start to wrap up Unit 6 and start moving into Unit 7. So make sure that you have those guided notes ready to go. Your learning objectives in this section, we're going to talk about two various kinds of factors that lead to various patterns of migration in this period from 1750 to 1900. So we'll talk about environmental factors that contributed to the development of those patterns of migration. And then you'll notice the second learning objective is to talk about the economic factors. So we'll talk about migration being influenced by changes in demographics, industrialized and unindustrialized societies, etc. People choosing to relocate for work, the new global capitalist economy. So the focus in this section is humans and the environment. Or if you remember back to the SPICE T chart, we're looking at interactions with the environment. And we'll also be taking a look at economic systems as well. So, this lecture focuses on the causes of migration in the period of 1750 to 1900. So, here you have four major factors that influence migration around the world: one being economic motivations, two being demographic changes, three being new transportation technologies, and four being shifting political or social conditions. Now, it's not necessary that you record the examples of each of those factors here. These are just to offer you a quick explanation of each. Of course, we're going to explore those factors in more depth as we go. And again, when we talk about migration, we're talking about the movement of people from one area to another with the intention of settling permanently, right? This is not people who were going on vacation or trying to travel to explore and then come home. These are people who are purposefully moving to move and live in a new place. So let's take a look at some of these factors a little bit more in detail. Now, typically, when we look at factors of migration, we look at two main types. First, being push factors, conditions that drive people to leave their home country or region, right? Think of pushing something away. These are usually negative things within the country of origin, economic hardship, political instability, environmental disasters, famine, persecution, etc., right? Conditions that make people want to leave their homeland. Now, pull factors, those are positive opportunities of a new country or region. Think of things that would attract someone, positive attractions, things that compel people to seek better opportunities or even safety elsewhere, right? These are things that we're going to lure people or bring people in. Those things are, economic opportunities, political freedoms, religious freedoms, higher standards of living, the presence of communities from the migrant's home country. So, right, think of even today of people who leave places in Mexico or Central America, Latin America, and come to the United States. They have people here in this country who are from their home regions or from their home countries. And so they may feel comfortable coming, and they may feel the opportunity to build this quality of life that is available to them here, right? These migrations decisions are typically influenced by kind of a combination of the two, right? Some people might just be compelled to come. Some people might just be forced to leave. But typically speaking, it's going to be people who feel some sort of both a push and a pull factor. Now, one exception to this concept is the idea of forced migration, where there is no choice in the matter for migrants, right? This is evident in migrations from the period through the transatlantic slave trade, for example, that we will explore later. Those are folks who did migrate from Africa to the Americas, but they had no choice in the matter, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. Now, these here are the major types of labor migration that we're going to see as we examine major migrations in this time period between 1750 and 1900. Labor is typically a major factor that contributed to most migrations in this period. But really, the type of labor systems varied. Forced migration through enslavement from Africa to the Americas until 1807 for Britain and 1865 for the United States, when the slave trade was finally banned. These folks were brought to the Americas to serve as enslaved labor on plantations. Convict labor involved the transportation of convicts from Britain to other European countries, or excuse me, Britain and other European countries to penal colonies, most notably Australia, as a solution for overcrowded prisons. So then those convicts are often employed in public works projects, building roads, building cities or other buildings, and serving under really severe conditions. Third is indentured servitude, right? A labor system where an individual has entered into a contract to work for a specific employer for a period of time in exchange for passage to a new country. Typically, this is seen for folks coming to the Americas or the Caribbean, for example, and was super prevalent in the 18th and 19th centuries, the 17 and 1800s, marked by really exploitative conditions, very similar to slavery, despite being pretty voluntary. Um, Contract labor emerges as a form where workers, often from Asia, agreed to work for an employer in a foreign country. Indentured servitude still happens today, right? Folks are brought from other places in the world, made to work here in the United States. We typically see that referred to as a form of human trafficking, right? People who are granted passage to the United States but have to work off their labor. But this is seen throughout the Middle East, throughout parts of Asia, so it's still something that's seen today. And then the last form of labor migration that we'll talk about is contract labor. This emerged as a form of migration where workers, often from Asia, would agree to work for an employer in a foreign country under a fixed contract. And this is really common, particularly when we talk about the construction of the railroads, plantation agriculture in places like Hawaii and the American West, providing essential labor for those regions, but often, again, under conditions that limited workers' rights and freedoms. But these are the four different types of labor migration that we will see. Then we also want to talk about the things that make this migration possible, right? We see the development of the steamship and railways during this period, which revolutionized global migration significantly. It reduced the cost and the duration of travel while increasing both the safety and accessibility of that travel. These technological advancements make it possible for millions of people to move across continents, move across oceans in search of better opportunities, and contributed to the massive waves of migrations that are really characteristic of this era. The steamship really enabled the mass movement of Europeans to the Americas and Australia, right? Which again, it's always interesting to hear people talk about people coming to America the right way. Back in this period, back in the 1700s, actually, we'll talk more about the 1800s to the 1900s. The quote unquote right way to come to the US was just to get on a boat in Europe and make it here, right? The journey across the Atlantic took several months previous to this, right before these steamships, but you could complete it in a few weeks. And so this made migration more feasible for those people who were seeking new lives in the New World. Similarly, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 shortened sea travel from Europe to South Asia and Australia, which encouraged migration to those regions as well. And then you have railways, on the other hand, transforming internal migration patterns, particularly in the United States. For example, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 opened up the western frontier to settlement and attracted migrants from both the eastern United States and Europe. We have examples in Russia as well, the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was completed between 1891 and 1916, which facilitated migrations of Russian peasants to places in Siberia, offering them agricultural opportunities. So the development of transportation here is really something that enhanced, not that migration didn't happen before this period, right? Between 1750 and 1900, migration definitely happened throughout history. But the advent and the development of transportation technology made that much better, made the enhancements to those migration patterns. All right, so now we're going to get through a few examples. You can see them labeled here on the map. And then you have a practice multiple choice questions in your notes that you have to complete. But we'll take a look at the different factors, the push factors, the pull factors that existed, and give you some more detail about some of these examples of migration. So let's get into the first one here, which is one that you should be more familiar with, and that is the transatlantic slave trade, right? It's something that we've talked about before, right? You should be familiar with that general topic, but it's important to note here this is a forced migration. So the push and pull factors don't necessarily apply to the people that are enslaved and forced to relocate, right? So again, we're looking at the transatlantic slave trade, which continued through 1807 and through 1865, depending on the location, moving folks from Central and Western Africa to the United States, to the Caribbean, and to Brazil. And if you really wanted to try to put in some factors here for that, and again, remember the kind of traditional push and pull factors don't exist here because this is a forced migration. But push factors, you could probably talk about kidnapping, warfare, trade by African and European slavers. Again, the push factor, the thing that made people leave, is forced migration. We don't really see any real pull factors for enslaved people who are forcibly brought to work on plantations in the Americas. Now, is that to say that there are no examples of people maybe voluntarily coming to the US to work from these regions? No. But the vast majority, the overwhelming, like 99.9% of folks that come from this region to the Americas in this period are forcibly migrated from Africa to the US. So that is one example here. The second is the Irish potato famine migration that took place between 1845 and 1852. This is also known in Europe more specifically as the Great Hunger. And it is a period of mass starvation, disease, and emigration from Ireland in this period. This catastrophe, right, this disaster is really caused by a potato disease known as the late blight, which destroyed the potato crop that was really a staple food for the majority of the population. Now, you can again tie this all the way back to European contact with the Americas. Right, when we first started in the age of exploration, the potato didn't exist here in Europe, right? And now in the 1800s, the mid 1800s, it is a staple crop. And the famine that took place because of the destroying of the crop is so significant that it makes people move, right? So the famine leads to the death of approximately 1 million people, prompted a significant wave of immigration with another roughly 1 million people fleeing Ireland, most to the United States, most to, as well to Canada and Australia as well, and in search of food, in search of work, in search of a better life, right? It has a profound demographic impact on the region and on the population of Ireland, and definitely has an impact on the populations of the other countries. So again, if we were to categorize what is the push factor, we want to think about what forced people to leave Ireland. It is this potato disease, the potato blight, which led to famine, great hunger, poverty, and death. Right? Those are I mean, death is a great reason to try and leave, right? To escape death, but that is what forced people, what pushed people away. What brought people, right? Why did they choose the United States? Why didn't they move to England or Scotland or what have you? Well, they moved to the United States and Canada and Australia because these were places that had, you know, large scale availability of land. They had great economic opportunities. There were already communities, Irish communities in these countries. There was already a small Irish population in the United States before this. There was already an Irish population in Canada, etc. So those are the things that motivated people to not just leave, but to choose to go to the United States or choose to go to Canada. Then in the late 19th century, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you have the Italian migration. And this is largely driven by economic factors. And again, you see sort of common themes here with the push factors: poverty, lack of land, the absence of industrialization in the South, in the southern parts of Italy. And this, again, prompted many Italians to seek opportunities elsewhere where there were industrial jobs available, particularly in the United States, particularly in Argentina and Brazil. And then additionally, you have political unrest and natural disasters such as the Messina earthquake in 1908, which kind of provided further acceleration into the Italian immigration in this period. So again, push factors: poverty, land scarcity, and political unrest. What motivated people to go to the United States, to Argentina, to Brazil? What's the industrialization that was taking place? The opportunities that were available in industrial employment, and again, established migrant communities. There were already Italians living in the United States, particularly in New York. There was a larger Italian population in New York, Little Italy, as it were. But there were also Italian communities in Argentina and in Brazil, etc. So that's what motivated them to choose those places, because they felt they could find the community to be a part of there. The next example is the Indian indentured servitude. This takes place from the 1830s, excuse me, to right around just after World War One, 1917. You have Indian immigration through indentured servitude, which is a response to the abolition of slavery by the British Empire. So if we go back a couple slides, you remember the slave trade ends right around 1807. And by the 1830s, the British are in need of labor. So there's a demand for cheap labor in these colonial plantations, particularly in the Caribbean, particularly in Africa, particularly in Southeast Asia. And India has economic hardships as well, particularly in rural areas of India, that motivated people to agree to these contracts that promised wages and, in some cases, promised them land or passage back to India. Now, despite those promises, many indentured laborers really faced slavery like conditions. They were subjected to exploitation, subjected to abuse in their destinations. So, again, what motivated people to want to leave India? What were the push factors? Again, common themes: poverty, famine, um, and again, disruption caused by British colonial policies. So the British had established a colony here in India, and those policies that we've talked about earlier in Unit 6 and elsewhere um, really caused a lot of economic hardship in India. Now, what pulled folks to go to these places, to the Caribbean, to Fiji, to Mauritius, to South Africa, etc.? What motivated people to go there? Well, there was a demand for labor, so there was opportunity for jobs on these plantations. So they were promised wages, they were promised land, they were promised eventual return to India. Like, you can go back to India whenever you're done with all your money, and didn't always work out that way. But that is what motivated people to go. Um, the next one is Chinese migration. Now, this takes place between the 1850s and the early 1900s. And we're talking particularly about places in the United States, Southeast Asia, Australia, and South Africa as well. And again, Chinese immigration is spurred on by a lot of factors here, and particularly economic distress, so economic instability that was caused by civil unrest, such as the Taiping Rebellion, natural disasters, which led to famine or hunger, poverty. So you'll notice that there's a little bit of similarity in a lot of these push factors, what motivates people to leave, make them want to go. The allure of the gold mountain during the gold rush period in California. So that's Princess, by the way. But the allure of this gold mountain. So 1849, gold is discovered in California, then begins the gold rush. So, hey, if I'm facing civil unrest, famine, and economic hardship in China, yeah, I'm going to move to California. I'm going to try to do that. But also, there were jobs as well. The Transcontinental Railroad was being built, and we brought in Chinese labor to do the jobs that the Anglo white American workers would not do, particularly working with explosives. Uh, Something I wish we could get into a little bit more as well, but we do get into it a little bit deeper in US history, is how Chinese workers were brought in to do explosives, blowing things up, blowing up tunnels and things like that through very dangerous conditions, mostly because their their bosses did not care whether they lived or died. But that's a conversation for a much different time. But those opportunities really contrasted by the challenges of discriminatory laws and policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which we'll cover in the next section, which reflected the broader xenophobic sentiments of the time. And we'll talk more about that in the next section. And of course, you'll get into much deeper detail about the Chinese Exclusion Act in US history as well. Now, next, we'll talk about Russian expansion and Siberian exile. So there's two formats of migration here that we'll talk about with Russia, particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries, which would be the 17 and 1800s. And there's a couple different factors. One, the Russian government is trying to solidify its control over this huge territory that's very sparsely populated. And they offer up things like free land, no serfdom, right? That attracts the voluntary settlers, like the peasants and the religious dissidents, people who are trying to get away from religious persecution. But also at the same time, the Russian state was using exile and penal labor as a means to punish and isolate criminals and political dissidents and people who disagreed politically or disagreed with the government, etc. So, like, if you disagreed with the state, they would send you to Siberia, right? And that would send many to work in the Siberian mines and Siberian settlements. And this is a practice that really became more systemic following reforms in the mid 19th century, in the mid 1800s. So again, when we look at push factors, you have political exile, penal labor, military conscription, right? Those are things that made people want to leave. Well, not made them want to leave, but made them leave, right? And then the pull factors, government incentives, land grants, tax exemptions. And the goal here was to incentivize and solidify Russian control over Siberia. The population between 1897 and 1914, we're talking about right around the time of World War I, increased in just a short period of time. You're looking at, 17 years, right? The population increased 73% due to those incentive programs to motivate people to go. Then we'll take a look at Japanese migration as well from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. Again, primarily driven through economic factors such as Japan undergoing this rapid modernization during the Meiji Restoration that we've talked about, disrupting that traditional agricultural practice. That caused rural unemployment, right? And the government and private companies really facilitated emigration to alleviate the problem and alleviate the pressure and the unemployment, and promoting opportunities abroad, especially in places like Hawaii and in the Americas, where there was a demand for labor in plantations, mines, and infrastructure projects. And again, these immigrant communities really sought to, and we call them here, we don't call them immigrant communities, right? You'll notice when we talk about it, we talk about them as emigrant communities, EMIGRANT. Emigrant, those are people who emigrated. So when they're coming in to a place, so for example, if we were to talk about it from the perspective of, say, Hawaii or the US, we would talk about these people as immigrating, right? But if we were to talk about it from the perspective of the Japanese, these are people who are leaving. They are emigrating. Okay, just keep that in mind if you see that on a test question or something like that. Emigration, roughly the same thing, but you're looking at it from the place where those people are leaving. They are emigrating from. But these communities, these immigrant communities, really wanted to get away from the constraints of the social hierarchy that existed in Japan. They wanted to achieve better economic prospects, etc. So what are the push factors? The Meiji Restoration leading to rural displacement, economic hardship, overpopulation, and poverty. Again, you'll notice poverty comes up a lot here. And then what are the pull factors? There's demand for labor. So there's opportunities for jobs, opportunities for employment, things that don't exist here in Japan for us. Development projects in the US, again, particularly the railroads, coffee plantations in Brazil, higher wages, better standards of living, etc. And then the Hawaiian government, and yes, the Hawaiian government, Hawaii was its own government before it became part of the United States. That is a whole conversation for another time. They were actively recruiting Japanese labor to come and work in those plantations because they needed the workers. And again, we'll talk more about Hawaii as we go. And then lastly, we'll talk about Lebanon, Lebanese migration. Uh, Lebanese immigration in, again, roughly the same period, the late 1800s to the early 1900s, is characterized by several factors: religious conflicts, economic hardships due to the decline in the silk industry, political instability of the Ottoman Empire. Um, you have Lebanese Christians who wanted to escape persecution. Lebanon is a predominantly Muslim uh, region. So you have the Christians who want to escape the religious persecution. Um, they are looking for new opportunities in the Americas and in West Africa, where they had already been engaging in trade and commerce with. So there's this promise of political freedom, this promise of economic prosperity, compared to the restrictions and the declining conditions in Lebanon. Really motivated a lot of people to leave Lebanon in this period. So again, push factors, you see some of the same ones: the economic hardship, religious persecution, political instability, um, the civil conflict of 1860, the subsequent tensions, etc. And what are the pull factors? Again, similarities all around: economic opportunities in trade, industry, commerce, political and religious freedom, joining established Lebanese and Syrian communities in the Americas and other regions, etc. So those are some of the examples in this particular period. Again, migration still happens, right? We immigrate. Immigration is a huge hot topic these days in the United States, for example. So migration still happens. There are still reasons why people leave, right? And hopefully, what you've garnered from here and what you've taken away from these examples here is it's never really people who want to come and, like, they're portrayed as invading these countries because we're amazing, right? That's not usually the case. Is that to say there's not like one or two folks out there who are immigrating to places like the United States because they're like, America's awesome, I want to go ruin it? Maybe, maybe. But for the most part, as you've seen through all of these examples here, most of the time it's poverty. Most of the time it's lack of economic opportunity. Most of the time it's danger. It's instability. It's economic decline, religious conflict. There are reasons why people leave their homeland, right? And make a dangerous journey to the United States, for example. And I'm just using the United States as an example. This is also true across Europe. People who emigrate from, say, the Middle East or Africa into Europe and places like France and the UK, etc. They don't do that just because, right? There's some form of opportunity that doesn't exist for them where they are. Um, and that's why they go, right? So hopefully, if you've seen from these examples, it's not people who are just trying to like invade a country and take over from within, or whatever is portrayed in most modern sources of political media these days. There's reasons why people come. There's hardship, there's economic conditions that exist, there's lack of jobs, etc., that exist where they live. So they are coming for opportunity. And because there are folks who already exist here, who live here already, who are part of their community, perhaps, right? So just think of those examples as we continue here. Now, again, hopefully you did your multiple choice question practice as well. There were a couple of questions there for you to practice. These are the key ideas for you to review. I would say, again, just having a good understanding of what is a push factor, right? What is a reason to leave a place? And what is a pull factor? What is a reason to move to that new place, right? Why am I leaving? And why am I going where I'm going, right? What pushed me to go? And what motivated me to go where I am going. The types of labor-based migration: forced labor migration, indentured servitude, contract labor, penal labor, etc. And then how we facilitate this mass migration, right? developments in transportation, and then the various examples that we gave you: the transatlantic slave trade, Irish resettlement, industrial workers from Italy, Chinese migration, Russian expansion into Siberia, Japanese plantation workers migrating to North and South America, and then Lebanese migration as well. So these are the key topics for your review out of the section. I will see you for 6.7 as we wrap up Unit 6.